May 13, 1975. 9:42 a.m. Lower Manhattan. A federal building with no name on the door. The room was smaller than he expected. No windows. One metal table. 2 chairs. The air smelled faintly of old paper. That detail would matter soon. Frank Lucas sat down without being told. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms open. A habit he'd learned long before this morning, when men decided your future by how steady you looked when you said nothing. Across from him, 2 federal agents waited. They didn't rush. They already believed they had the power. Frank didn't correct them. One agent slid a folder forward. The kind of weight that meant years. The folder stopped inches from Frank's fingers. Nobody touched it. "You know why you're here?" the agent said. Frank nodded once. Silence followed. Long enough to test him. He didn't blink. Somewhere in that pause, a line was crossed. Not on paper. In memory. In a code taught to him by a man who was no longer alive. Frank didn't know this moment would rewrite everything. "Oh, we'll get to that." The agent leaned back. The chair creaked. A small sound, but it shifted the room. "Power testing power. You built something," the agent said. "Something big." Frank's eyes stayed on the folder. He knew what was inside without opening it. Names. Routes. Money flows. Graves that never made the paper. Another agent spoke. "You could lose it all today." Frank smiled barely. "Or trade," he said. The word landed heavy. Trade meant betrayal. Not of men in the streets, of a rule. A rule that came from one voice, one lesson, repeated 100 times in Harlem back rooms. Never talk to the law. That rule belonged to Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had said it calmly. No threat. No sermon. Just fact. "The law remembers," he told Frank. "Men forget." Frank remembered. The agent opened the folder just enough to show the edge of a photograph. A face Frank recognized. Someone who thought he was protected. This detail would matter soon. "People are talking already," the agent said. "They just don't know you are." Frank lifted his eyes for the first time. He studied the agent's tie. Department issue. The man thought authority came from the badge. That was his mistake. Frank spoke quietly. "If they were talking," he said, "you wouldn't need me." The agent didn't answer. That told Frank everything. Another silence. Different now. Tighter. Frank leaned forward. The metal table felt cold against his forearms. Cold meant reality. No stories. No speeches. "You want me," Frank said. "Not bodies. Not headlines. You want structure." The agent hesitated. A flicker. He hadn't expected that word. Structure was power. Frank continued. "You want how it moves. Who touches what? Who trusts who?" He paused. "And who thinks they're safe?" That landed. The agent closed the folder. Slowly. Too slowly. He thought the move showed control. Frank watched him do it. The betrayal wasn't in what Frank was offering. It was in what he was withholding. He wasn't scared. He was selecting. We'll return to this moment. Because years earlier, before the empire, before the suits, Frank Lucas had been invisible. A driver. A shadow. A man who learned by watching someone else command rooms without raising his voice. That man had taught him patience. Timing. The value of letting others believe they were winning. Bumpy Johnson had ruled Harlem without chasing it. Respect followed him. Fear stayed quiet. And Frank had taken notes. Now Bumpy was gone. Dead in 1968. The streets still whispered his name like a warning. Frank's empire had risen after that. Not loud. Not flashy. Efficient. Military. Cold. And now, in this room, Frank faced a different kind of gun. Paper. Witness lists. Long sentences. The agent broke the silence. "You help us," he said. "We help you." Frank tilted his head. A small motion. Calculated. "You don't help me," Frank said. "You step aside." The agent frowned. He didn't like that phrasing. Frank leaned back. The chair didn't creak. He had weight. "There are people you can't reach," Frank said. "Because they don't exist on paper. I can reach them." Another pause. This one cut deeper. The agent finally asked, "Why now?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He thought of Bumpy. Of lessons given without affection. Of loyalty as currency, not emotion. Then he spoke. "Because the game changed," he said. "And some men didn't notice." That was the betrayal. Not rage. Not desperation. Calculation. Outside the room, the city moved like nothing important was happening. Inside, an entire underworld leaned without knowing it. Nobody in Harlem knew yet. Nobody on the streets suspected that the code was already bleeding. And the men who thought they held power that morning would soon realize they were holding something else entirely. We'll come back to what Frank gave them. But first, you need to understand where he learned to wait. Harlem, early 1960s. The streets didn't announce power back then. They measured it. Quietly. Block by block. Who walked slow. Who didn't look over their shoulder. Who spoke once and got obedience. That was Bumpy Johnson. He didn't dress loud. No need. His reputation arrived before him. When Bumpy entered a room, conversation adjusted itself. Jazz played lower. Chairs scraped back. Not out of fear, but understanding. Frank Lucas watched all of this from the driver's seat. Literally. He opened doors. Carried bags. Stood outside clubs while deals were made inside. Men underestimated him because he was useful, not important. That was their first mistake. Frank learned by listening. By noticing who waited and who rushed. Who bragged and who stayed silent. Harlem was full of loud men. Bumpy wasn't one of them. One night, parked outside a brownstone, Frank heard a gunshot echo down the block. Single crack. Sure. It didn't sound frantic. It sounded final. That sound mattered. Bumpy stepped back into the car minutes later. Come. Adjusted his coat. Didn't explain. Frank didn't ask. That was the lesson. Violence wasn't power. Control was. Bumpy ran Harlem like a boardroom. He negotiated with Italians who thought they owned the city. He corrected them without raising his voice. He understood something they didn't. Harlem was loyal. But loyalty had to be respected. Frank watched how Bumpy treated people who mattered. Quiet conversations. Clear boundaries. And how he treated people who didn't, by ignoring them until they disappeared. This detail will matter soon. Frank wasn't muscle. He wasn't a shooter. Bumpy didn't need another gun. He needed someone who could see patterns. Who could move without being seen. Frank became that. By the mid-60s, Harlem was changing. The Italians were still powerful but distracted. Fighting each other. Chasing headlines. The police were predictable. Corrupt in familiar ways. Bumpy adapted. He always did. Frank saw something else. Opportunity beyond the neighborhood. Bigger than numbers running on Lenox Avenue. Bigger than local enforcement. He saw supply. Most men in Harlem fought over corners. Frank paid attention to where the product came from, and how sloppy that pipeline was. He kept those thoughts to himself. That restraint is why Bumpy trusted him. Trust didn't come easily. When it did, it was conditional. Bumpy tested Frank constantly. Small things. Errands with consequences. Introductions without explanation. Frank passed every time. One afternoon, Bumpy said something that stuck. Power isn't taking, Bumpy said. It's being allowed. Frank nodded. He never forgot it. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson was dead. Natural causes, they said. The streets didn't argue, but they felt hollow. A structure without its center. Harlem went quiet in a way that felt wrong. Men who'd waited years started moving. Loudly. Competing. Posturing. Frank didn't. He attended the funeral. Stood in the back. Watched who cried. Watched who smiled. That told him everything. After Bumpy, there was no single king. Just noise. That vacuum created danger and opportunity. Frank stepped forward without announcing himself. He built differently. No street-level chaos. No flashy displays. He went upstream. Overseas. Military routes. Systems that didn't care about race or neighborhood. Heroin came in cleaner. Cheaper. More reliable. The streets noticed results before they noticed him. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas controlled something Bumpy never had. A vertically integrated operation. From source to sale. That's when law enforcement noticed. Not because of violence. Because of efficiency. The Italians noticed too. They underestimated him. That was their fatal strategic mistake. Frank wasn't playing their game. He was rewriting it. And then, quietly, the pressure started. Wiretaps. Surveillance. Indictments building without arrests. The kind of pressure that doesn't knock. It waits. Frank felt it before anyone else did. That's why years later he sat calmly in that federal room. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was prepared. But there was still one question hanging over everything. Did Frank betray Bumpy's code, or did he perfect it? We'll return to that answer. By 1972, the pressure wasn't loud. It was organized. That's how Frank Lucas knew it was real. Sirens were for amateurs. Raids were for headlines. What surrounded Frank was quieter. Phones that clicked once before going dead. Faces he didn't recognize parked too long on familiar blocks. Men asking questions they already knew the answers to. This detail would matter soon. Frank adjusted by doing what he always did. He reduced visibility. Fewer meetings. Fewer voices. Decisions passed through fewer hands. Power concentrates under pressure. His family noticed first. Not the danger, his absence. Dinners missed. Conversations cut short. He listened more than he spoke. The same way Bumpy had. That comparison stayed with him. Bumpy had believed in a code that survived scrutiny. Never talk. Never fold. Endure. He'd lived long enough to see men break themselves against that rule. Frank believed in outcomes. There's a difference. One night, Frank sat alone in his office. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke. That wasn't comfort, it was memory. He hadn't lit one. Someone else had been there earlier. That meant something had shifted. Frank didn't panic. He opened a ledger instead. Numbers told the truth faster than people did. Revenue was stable. Supply intact. Street noise controlled. But one line item stood out. Losses where there shouldn't have been any. This detail would matter soon. Someone inside was leaking. Not money. Information. Frank didn't confront anyone. That would reveal concern. Instead he altered routes. Changed schedules. Gave different versions of the same instruction to different men. He waited. The law meanwhile thought they were closing in. They mistook proximity for control. They watched Frank without understanding how little he needed to move to remain powerful. That was their critical mistake. Because Frank had already begun planning for a future without the streets. Not retirement. Transition. The code Bumpy lived by had one flaw. It assumed the game never changed. Frank had seen too much to believe that. He remembered something Bumpy once said after a long night. Loyalty isn't forever, Bumpy had said. It's rented. Frank paid attention. When the first indictment came down, it didn't surprise him. He expected it. What surprised everyone else was how ready he was. Bail was posted within hours. Lawyers already briefed. Contingencies activated. The streets whispered. Some admired it. Others grew uneasy. That unease spread. Men began asking a dangerous question in private. Is Frank untouchable, or just preparing to disappear? Frank heard the question before it reached him. That's when the family pressure intensified. Not fear, exhaustion. Years of vigilance were on people who never chose the life. Frank understood that too. One evening his wife asked him something simple. How long does this last? Frank didn't answer immediately. He tasted something metallic in his mouth. Stress, not fear. It lasts until it doesn't, he said. That wasn't reassurance. It was honesty. Soon after, a trusted lieutenant made his move. Subtle. A request for distance. Less exposure. Less risk. Frank granted it. That told him everything. The betrayal wasn't coming from outside. It was forming inside the assumption that Frank would never bend. But Frank had already bent, strategically. He began separating himself from operations. Delegating more. Touching less. Creating layers between himself and the street. The law mistook this for weakness. They pushed harder. And that's when Frank made his most important decision. Not to run. Not to fight. But to choose the timing of his fall. We'll return to that moment. Because when Frank Lucas walked into that federal room in 1975, he wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan years in the making. And the men who believed they'd cornered him had no idea he was about to trade something far more valuable than freedom. He was about to trade silence. The main confrontation didn't happen in court. It happened weeks earlier in that same federal room, when the agents finally believed they were in control. The clock on the wall clicked once every second. That sound mattered. Frank Lucas sat still. The agents thought patience was on their side. They had files. Warrants. Tom. They were wrong. You're facing life, one agent said. Calm. Confident. He believed it. Frank looked at the clock. Then back at the man. Life doing what? He asked. The agent frowned. That wasn't the response he expected. We know your routes, the agent said. Your people. Your money. Frank nodded. Some of it, he said. That was the first crack. Frank leaned forward. The metal table felt warm now. That meant the room had adjusted to him. You know pieces, Frank said. But you don't know the order. Silence. This was the twist they didn't see coming. Frank wasn't offering information to save himself. He was offering control to people who'd never had it. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. No names. Just dates. Shipments. Locations. The agents scanned it. Their posture changed. Shoulders straightened. Breathing shifted. They finally understood what they were looking at. This detail would matter soon. You can dismantle an entire network, Frank said quietly. Not mine. Everyone else's. The agent tried to hide his reaction. Failed. You expect immunity? He asked. Frank shook his head. I expect leverage. That was the power flip. The agents had come prepared to break a man. Instead, they'd met someone who'd already broken the system into components. Frank continued. You take them down, he said. Quietly. One by one. I disappear. And Harlem? The agent asked. Frank's eyes hardened. Just slightly. Harlem adapts, he said. That was the betrayal. Not of people. Of permanence. This was the moment Bumpy Johnson's code finally fractured. Bumpy Johnson had believed that silence preserved power. Frank had learned something harsher. Silence only worked while everyone believed in it. The streets didn't anymore. The agent asked the wrong question next. Why help us? Frank smiled. Not warmly. Because you're already here, he said. And you don't leave empty-handed. That's when the agents realized something unsettling. Frank wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of irrelevance. By cooperating, he didn't just survive, he decided who fell with him. The paperwork took hours. Statements recorded. Conditions negotiated. But the real damage happened afterward. When indictments began landing, not on Frank's crew, but on men who thought they were untouchable. Italian bosses. Connectors. Middlemen who'd built careers assuming loyalty would protect them. It didn't. The underworld froze. Phones stopped ringing. Meetings were canceled. Men stared too long at each other. Nobody knew who had spoken. That uncertainty was lethal. Frank didn't need to testify publicly. His information moved behind closed doors. Quiet. Surgical. That was intentional. Because the goal wasn't revenge. It was erasure. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, the power had already shifted, away from the old rules toward something colder. Something more modern. This is the moment history simplified as Frank Lucas became an informant. That phrasing misses the point. Frank didn't just talk. He chose who would be remembered, and who wouldn't. We'll see what that cost him next. The consequences didn't arrive with gunfire. They arrived with silence. Harlem noticed first. Not because anything exploded, but because nothing did. Corners stayed empty. Clubs closed early. Men who used to argue in public stopped appearing altogether. Fear had changed shape. Nobody knew who had spoken. That was the problem. When indictments kept coming, quiet arrests, sealed cases, men vanishing into courtrooms without press, rumors hardened into paranoia. Every conversation felt monitored. Every handshake felt like a test. Trust collapsed faster than violence ever could. This detail would matter soon. Frank watched it all from a distance. Not hiding. Just absent. He had calculated that absence was louder than presence. Men asked his name in whispers. Not out of respect anymore, but uncertainty. Was he still powerful? Or had he crossed a line no one could uncross? That question did the damage for him. Because power in the underworld depends on one thing above all else: predictability. Frank had removed that. Former allies didn't seek revenge. They sought explanation. That told him everything he needed to know. They didn't understand the move. Which meant they couldn't counter it. The Italians reacted the worst. They'd built empires on hierarchy and ritual. On the assumption that betrayal was punished swiftly and publicly. This was neither. There was no spectacle. No message body. Just the slow realization that someone had rearranged the board while they were still arguing about the rules. One old boss reportedly said nothing when he heard. He just stopped eating. That's how shame manifests in men who once believed themselves immortal. This wasn't blood. It was humiliation. Frank felt the shift internally too. The adrenaline was gone. Replaced by something colder. Lighter. He slept differently. But there was a cost. Respect didn't follow him anymore. Distance did. Old associates crossed the street rather than greet him. Not out of anger. Out of caution. He'd become unknowable. That's when the moral loop closed in on him. Had he preserved himself, or erased the very thing that made survival meaningful? Frank didn't answer that question publicly. He didn't need to. The law treated him carefully now. Useful, but never trusted. He taught them too much about leverage to be fully embraced. That was his mistake. By choosing control over loyalty, Frank had removed himself from both worlds. Too compromised for the streets. Too dangerous for the system. He'd won, but at the cost of belonging. And yet, when men spoke of him, they spoke carefully. That was the residue of power. No one dared say his name casually. It carried implications. A reminder that the old codes were dead, and someone had proven it. This is what the streets learned too late. You don't have to fire a shot to end an era. You just have to make everyone question who's still playing by the rules. Frank Lucas didn't destroy the underworld. He exposed its assumptions. And that exposure left scars deeper than bullets ever could. We'll return to the final reckoning. Because legends aren't judged by how they rise, but by what remains after they leave. Years later, the story settled into something smaller than it deserved. Headlines reduced it. Movies softened it. People argued about motives like that changed outcomes. It didn't. What mattered was the shift that never reversed. After Frank Lucas, the streets stopped believing in permanence. The old certainty, that silence guaranteed survival, was gone. Not challenged. Proven fragile. That was the real damage. Frank lived with the consequences quietly. No throne. No comeback tour. No redemption arc. Just distance. Distance from men who once trusted him. Distance from a system that used him but never forgot what he'd shown them. He had answered every question except one. Did he betray Bumpy Johnson? The streets said yes. Loudly. Quickly. It made the story easier to digest. But the truth was more uncomfortable. Bumpy's code was built for a world where power moved slowly. Where men aged into influence. Where reputation could outlast attention. Frank had seen the next version coming. International supply. Federal coordination. Surveillance without noise. A game where the old rules became liabilities. He didn't break the code out of weakness. He broke it because it was already breaking. That's the part nobody likes to admit. Frank didn't destroy loyalty. He exposed how conditional it always was. The men who fell after him weren't victims of betrayal. They were victims of assumption. They believed the game owed them continuity. It never does. In private moments, Frank acknowledged the cost. Not with regret. Regret implies error. With clarity. He'd traded community for control. That's a deal that always collects interest. The underworld adapted. It always does. New rules replaced old ones. Quieter. More transactional. Less sentimental. Fear didn't disappear. It professionalized. And Frank became something rare and dangerous in criminal history. Not a martyr, not a king, not a cautionary tale. A pivot point. From that moment on, power was no longer measured by how long you stayed silent, but by how well you understood timing. That's the loop that closes here. The meeting in the federal room wasn't desperation. It was transition. The losses in the ledger weren't leaks. They were tests. The absence afterward wasn't hiding. It was consequence. And the betrayal everyone focused on wasn't against a man. It was against an idea, that loyalty alone could protect you in a world that no longer honored it. Frank Lucas lived long enough to see that proven. He didn't win clean. He didn't lose loudly. He survived by changing the definition of power. And that's why his story still unsettles people. Because it asks a question no one wants to answer. When the rules stop working, is breaking them betrayal or evolution? That's the real legacy. Like the video if you believe power is about timing. Comment below, was Frank a traitor or a realist? Subscribe for more true crime stories where silence isn't always strength. And if you think this story ended quietly, wait until you hear what happened when another king tried to walk into a room unarmed.